a complicated topic. A lot of people hear about it on the news only, and it sounds a little simple. Oh, they're just all Chinese balloons, or they're all seagulls or something. And no, it's not that simple. When you dig into this, it's very complicated, very weird, and very interesting. And I find it surprising that a lot of my colleagues in physics don't dive into this with enthusiasm, because this is probably the most exciting thing I've ever studied in my entire career. So, UAP stands for, well, they used to be called UFOs. That's kind of a dirty word, tainted with all sorts of crazy ideas like tinfoil hats and weird people carrying little blow-up aliens and, running around Roswell and places like this. So there's a lot of connotations that come with UFO. And so the term was changed to UAP because if you want to engage with people in Congress, you can't go in trying to talk about UFOs. Nobody's going to want to do that. I will slip up. No, I'm not going to slip up. I will do it on purpose. I will use the term UFO because I'm interested in the objects. Not all UAPs are objects. Some seem to be atmospheric phenomena. That is true. Some of them are. And I'll go into some detail. But I'm really interested in the objects. There are some of these things are clearly technologically advanced craft. And this is more than exciting. So what are UAP? Congress now defines UAP as unidentified aerospace, instead of aerial, undersea phenomena. That may come as a bit of a surprise to you. And in fact, the undersea part is understated. This is probably the most interesting aspect of the phenomenon. And the times that over the last 2 years, I've briefed Senator Gillibrand's team twice. We've briefed the House of Representatives Armed Services Committee, the Department of National Intelligence, FBI, and all of these organizations asked the same question. What are your capabilities for observing underwater? So clearly, there's something known about these things and water. This is a really fraught term still. There's two of the words in this acronym are ambiguous, unidentified and phenomena. And their ambiguity is horribly misused. It provides an opportunity to denialists, I'll call them, who use that to suggest that we have no idea at all what we're talking about when we talk about these things. We actually know quite a bit about them, some of them, and I'll go into that. But it's important to remember that UAP are a class of phenomena, not a single thing. These are all pictures of UAP. Some of them are identifiable, and I will show you pictures of one of them and point that out. But you can see these are all quite different. And at this point, the UAP taxa are unknown. There are multiple hypotheses, and several are probably correct or close. And so we should expect confusion and conflation where we have different types of UAP that seem similar. People can easily mistake bats for birds in the evening, and that's a common, that type of conflation we expect here as well. Now, of course, being skeptical is important. I'm a scientist, and by nature we're skeptical, and this is how we are sure we know what we know when we feel that we know something. Not all UAP are structured craft. They're not all alien spaceships. Absolutely true statement. So I'll take this image, for instance. This interesting thing. This was photographed in Vancouver. The person was actually taking pictures of the ships, and this appeared in one of the photos. Some of you might be able to recognize this. Many people couldn't. Let me zoom in on this object. And it might still be unidentifiable, but it'll be a little more clear in the next picture. It's a seagull. Yes, some of them are seagulls. The ones the Navy are photographing with their FLIR cameras and chasing around with their jet fighters are not seagulls. That's ridiculous. The people who claim that, I don't think have ever seen a seagull. I'm a lifelong bird watcher. My father was a wildlife artist. I've been bird watching since I was 5. I've seen over 20 species of seagull in the world. I've seen 2/3 of the species of seagulls in the world. And when I saw this picture, I was like, that's a gull. I was able to identify it pretty quickly just because of that. That is not what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to talk about seagulls. We'll save that for a biology talk. Now, an interesting thing about seagulls, I am told that seagulls are not hard to shoot down. I've not tried this. I would not try it. But some UAP are, and I'm going to play or talk about this first. I have a slide before I have my video. So in April of 1980, Comandante Oscar Santa Maria Huerta was at the La Jolla Air Force Base in Peru. They had an event going on where they had 1,800 military personnel on base outside, and there was an object hovering near the base. And fearing espionage, they sent Comandante Santa Maria up in his plane to investigate and to shoot it down if necessary. So he flew at this thing several times and shot 64 30-millimeter shells at this thing. These are not a joke. You don't want to get hit with something like this. One of these will rip your car apart. These are meant to bring aircraft down. So I'm going to play a video where he discusses the encounter, and it's in Spanish, but I have English subtitles, so.
Buenos días, damas y caballeros. Mi nombre es Oscar Santamaría Huertas y soy oficial piloto de la Fuerza Aérea del Perú en situación de retiro actualmente.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Oscar Santamaría Huertas, official pilot of the Peruvian Air Force, currently retired.
El 11 de abril de 1980, a las 7:15 horas de la mañana, 1,800 hombres estaban en formación en la base aérea de La Joya, Arequipa.
On April 11, 1980, at 7:15 in the morning, 1,800 men were in formation at the airbase of La Joya, Arequipa.
Todos ellos observaron un objeto estacionario en el aire, que parecía un globo, como a 5 kilómetros de distancia y a unos 600 metros de altitud. Era luminoso porque reflejaba el sol.
They all observed a stationary object in the sky which looked like a balloon at about 3 miles distance and approximately 1,800 feet altitude. It was luminous because it reflected the sun.
Mi comandante de unidad me dio la orden de despegar en mi jet Sukhoi 22 para dispararle al objeto esférico, porque estaba en espacio prohibido, sin permiso, y temíamos espionaje.
My unit commander ordered me to take off in my Sukhoi 22 jet to shoot down the spherical object. It was in restricted airspace without clearance, and we were concerned about espionage.
Yo me acerqué al objeto y le disparé 64 obuses de 30 milímetros. Algunos obuses fueron contra el terreno y otros le pegaron de lleno al objeto, pero sin ningún efecto. Los obuses no rebotaron, probablemente fueron absorbidos. La pared de fuego en forma de cono que yo mandé normalmente hubiera destruido cualquier objeto en su camino.
I approached the object and strapped 64 30-millimeter shells at it. Some projectiles went towards the ground and others hit the object fully, but they had no effect at all. The projectiles didn't bounce off, probably they were absorbed. The cone-shaped wall of fire that I sent out will normally obliterate anything in its path.
El objeto entonces empezó a subir y a alejarse de la base. Y cuando yo estaba a unos 11,000 metros, de repente se detuvo, forzándome a salir del lado porque ya me encontraba a solo 500 metros de él. Entonces hice un ascenso para atacarlo desde arriba, pero justo cuando ya lo había centrado en la mira y estaba listo a disparar, el objeto hizo un ascenso vertical evadiendo mi ataque.
The object then began to ascend and move farther away from the base. When I was about 30,000 feet, it made a sudden stop, forcing me to veer to the side since I was only 1,500 feet away. I flew up higher to attack it from above, but just as I had locked on the target and was ready to shoot, the object made a straight vertical climb, evading the attack.
2 veces más tuve al objeto en la mira, cuando éste se encontraba estacionario, y cada vez se alejó al último momento antes de mi disparo, siempre evadiendo mi ataque.
2 more times I had the object on target, when the object was stationary. Each time it moved away at the very last minute, when I was about to fire, always eluding my attack.
Entonces, decidí hacer un ascenso a toda velocidad para ponerme muy por encima del objeto, pero este empezó a subir también y casi en paralelo con mi avión. Cuando sobrepasé los 19,000 metros, el objeto se detuvo.
I decided to climb at full thrust to get above the object, but it began to ascend almost parallel to my plane, and when I reached 63,000 feet, it stopped.
Fue entonces que me acerqué a 100 metros del objeto. Tenía unos 10 metros de diámetro, estaba como esmaltado con una cúpula de color crema sobre una base metálica ancha y circular. No tenía motores, ni escapes, ni ventanas, ni alas o antenas. Carecía de todos los implementos típicos de un avión y sin ningún sistema visible de propulsión.
At this point, I came to within about 300 feet of the UFO. It was about 30 feet in diameter. It was enamel, cream-colored dome with a wide circular metallic base. It had no engines, no exhaust, no windows, no wings or antenna. It lacked all the typical aircraft components with no visible propulsion system.
Fue en ese momento que me di cuenta que esto no era un objeto para espiar, sino que era un ovni, algo completamente desconocido. Ya casi no tenía combustible, o sea que ya no podía ni atacar ni maniobrar mi avión, tampoco escaparme a alta velocidad, y sentí temor. Quizás este era mi fin.
It was at that moment that I realized was not a spying device, but that it was a UFO, something totally unknown. I was almost out of fuel, so I couldn't attack or maneuver my plane or make a high-speed escape. I was afraid. I thought I might be finished.
Entonces logré calmarme y avisé por radio que otro avión viniera para echar un vistazo. Me dijeron que no, que estaba demasiado alto, que simplemente me regresara. Tuve que planear parte de mi descenso por falta de combustible, haciendo zigzag y siempre viendo por mis espejos retrovisores con la esperanza de que el objeto no me persiguiera. No pasó nada.
When I had calmed down, I radioed for another plane to come and I have a look trying to hide my fear. They say, no, it's too high, just come back. I had to glide part way down due to lack of fuel, zigzagging to make my plane harder to hit, always with my eyes on the rear view mirrors, hoping it wouldn't chase me. It didn't.
Pasé 22 minutos de maniobras contra el objeto. Después de que aterricé, el objeto permaneció estacionario en el cielo por 2 horas más a la vista de todos en la base.
I had spent 22 minutes maneuvering with this object. After I landed, the object remained stationary in the sky for 2 hours for everyone at the base to see.
Un documento del Ministerio de la Defensa de los Estados Unidos, intitulado OVNI visto en Perú, describió el incidente, diciendo que el origen del objeto sigue desconocido.
A U.S. Department of Defense document titled UFOs Sighted in Peru described the incident, stating that the vehicle's origin remains unknown.
Todavía me da escalofrío cuando me acuerdo.
It still gives me chills to think about it.
Muchas gracias.
So this is an interesting case, and there's a few important things to learn from this. Excuse me. First, UFOs are not an American thing. They're global. Every country has encountered these objects, and many countries have been studying them. Very often they are fired upon, and I have to ask, is that really a good idea? We don't know what, is it really a good idea to shoot at what you don't know? It's something when you don't know what it is. You should know what your target is before you shoot at it. Anybody who owns a gun knows this. And if this belonged to a foreign country, shooting at it would be an act of war. And so if this belongs to some other peoples, we have welcomed them to Earth with an act of war. That's really worrisome and is really a potential problem. It also doesn't have any of the equipment necessary for flight. There's no visible propulsion, no way for it to stay aloft. We don't know how they fly at all. So this also is quite typical. And it's clearly under intelligent control because it's evading the attack. So there's several interesting features here. Now these things haven't always been seen from a distance. There have been events where people have gotten close to them. There's the incident in England in a place called Rendlesham Forest, which is a small woods between Bentwaters and Woodbridge air bases. And a craft landed there and was investigated by Sergeant James Peniston and John Burroughs. And they were able to investigate this object for quite a period of time, walk around it, touch it, draw pictures of it. They tried to take photographs. The photographs didn't turn out. It was a film camera. So this is a drawing of the object. It is about the size of my Honda Accord. And this is a picture of what was actually embossed on the craft. So I'll let James Peniston discuss this.
I'm not sure if it's good morning or good afternoon here. It's 12 o'clock. My name is James Peniston, United States Air Force retired. In 1980, I was assigned to the largest tactical fighter wing in the Air Force at the time. I was stationed at RAF Woodbridge, England. I was the senior security officer in charge of that base security. At that time, I held a top secret U.S. and NATO security clearance and was responsible for the protection of the war-making resources for that base. Shortly after midnight on the 26th of December 1980, Staff Sergeant Steffens briefed me that some lights were seen in Rendlesham Forest, just outside the back gate. He informed me that whatever he seen didn't crash. He told me it landed. I discounted that and reported to the control center at the base that we had a possible downed aircraft. I then ordered Airman Kabanzak, A1C Burroughs to respond with me off-site. When we arrived to the suspected crash site, it quickly became apparent that we were not dealing with a plane crash, or for that matter, anything else we've ever responded to. There was a bright light emanating from an object on the forest floor. As we approached it on foot, a silhouetted triangular craft about 9 feet long, 6.5 feet high, came into view. The craft was fully intact and sitting in a small clearing just inside the woods. As the three of us got closer to the craft, we started experiencing radio difficulties. I then asked Airman Kabanzak to relay the radio transmissions back to our control center, act as a relay. Burroughs and I proceeded towards the craft. When we came up on the triangular-shaped craft, there were blue and yellow lights swirling around the exterior as though they were part of the surface. The air around us was electrically charged, and we could feel it on our clothes, our skin, and our hair. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I was witnessing. After 10 minutes without any apparent aggression, I determined the craft was non-hostile to my team and to the base. Following the security protocols, we completed a thorough on-site investigation. This included a full physical examination of the craft, which included photographs and my notebook entries that I had at the time, and relays with the radio through Airman Kabanzak to our control center. Those were required. On one side of the craft, there were symbols that measured 3 inches high, and they're approximately about 2.5 feet long. The feeling I had during the encounter was like no type of aircraft that I've ever seen before. It was in the Jane's book of known aircraft or anything I've seen since. After roughly about 45 minutes, the light from the craft began to intensify. Burroughs and I then took a defensive position away from the craft as it lifted off the ground without any noise or air disturbance. It maneuvered through the trees and shot off at an unbelievable rate of speed. It was gone in a blink of an eye. In my law book that I have right here, I wrote, "Speed, impossible." That night, over 80 Air Force personnel, all trained observers assigned to the 81st Security Police Squadron, witnessed the takeoff. The information acquired during that investigation was reported through my military channels. The team and witnesses were told to treat the investigation as top secret, and no further discussion would be allowed. The photographs that we retrieved from the base lab, 2 rolls of 35 millimeter, of course, were apparently overexposed. Thank you.
So you can easily have overexposed film if you've got radiation in the area. And later there were radiation measurements done and the radiation was higher than background. So this case is really important. I've heard skeptics talk about this case and say, oh, they probably saw the light from the lighthouse over that way going through the trees and this, and in reference to part of the sighting. He investigated the craft for 45 minutes. Come on, 45 minutes walking around the craft, touching it, drawing the symbols, drawing the craft, taking notes. 45 minutes. And then, of course, is the speed. Speed impossible. I love that phrase. People often ask, why does everybody think these are alien spacecraft? And I will repeat, and I'll say it again later in this talk when we talk about speeds, because they go as fast as spacecraft. They fly as fast as spacecraft fly. It's that simple. And as a scientist who has, for his whole life, watched sci-fi, this event thrills me because it means that it may actually be possible to have a spacecraft that you can keep in your garage. How cool would that be? I mean, that possibility alone should have half the scientists on board studying this. But things are changing. So again, here's the drawing. There's the 3-inch high symbols and an emblem that he discussed.
There are only 2 conceivable explanations for what happened. Either a UFO landed there, causing the damage and collateral business which I have already mentioned, or the deputy commander of a United States nuclear-armed air base in Britain and several hundred of his men were hallucinating. Now, I put it to you, I put it to anybody with an atom of common sense. Either of those explanations, and they are the only 2 possible explanations, must be of defense interest. Don't tell me otherwise.
Many people have seen these things, and in fact, astronauts have seen them. And this is Gordon Cooper had encountered an object while he was in charge of tests of landings of the U-2 spy plane at Edwards Air Force Base, and so he'll discuss this. These aren't silly people. Astronauts have seen things in space as well, and have talked about it. I talked to Alan Bean, who was on Apollo 12, and he had told me that when he was on Skylab, they saw an object off in the distance with a red flashing light, and it approached Skylab for some time and then left. Satellites don't have lights on them. They work to get every gram of material off because it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to lift anything up. So you don't put, there's no reason for a light to have a satellite, or for a satellite to have a light. So these things are strange.
I was having some cameramen film the installation of a precision landing facility that we were putting in right on the edge of the dry lake. And this saucer flew right over them and put down 3 little gear and landed out on the dry lake bed. And they went out to, picked up their cameras and moved on out toward him filming. And he lifted off, put the gear back in the well, and climbed out at a very high rate of speed and disappeared. And so while I was going through all the regulation books and finding out the number to call in Washington to report it, I had them go over and develop the film. By the time they got back with the developed film, I was on the higher and higher and higher level officer talking to me. Finally with the colonel telling me to when the film arrived at my desk, to put it in the carrier pouch. There would be a courier there at my office by that time already, and they'd arranged for him to fly in our base airplane back to Washington with these films. I had a chance to hold it up to the window and look at it. It was certainly a good film. I think they're for real. I think eventually we'll find out that there's regular travel here on this Earth from other planets.
Where are these? I'd love to see these films. Why can't we see them? Maybe in the next talk we'll address some of these issues. So these UAPs have some interesting characteristics, especially the ones that appear to be objects. And the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which ran from 2007 to 2012. This is the program that was first discussed in the New York Times article in 2017. This program identified 5, what they call the 5 observables. These are 5 characteristics that are unique to UAPs. Positive lift without any flight surfaces. Sudden or instantaneous acceleration. As a physicist, I'm a little worried about instantaneous. You can't measure anything instantaneous, but sudden is good enough. These things accelerate very high rates. Hypersonic velocity without signatures. Signatures meaning there's no sonic booms, there's no fireballs. These things will go barreling through the atmosphere. There are radar measurements of these things barreling through the atmosphere at tens of thousands of miles an hour. No sonic boom, no fireball. Very strange. Transmedium travel. This means they go effortlessly from air to water, water to air. And low observability or cloaking. They are sometimes hard to see and are not always very clear. And you often hear people complain, oh, why are there never any good photographs of these things? Well, that's characteristic number 5. Low observability. They are hard to see, hard to photograph. And then there's actually a 6th one, which is kind of left out of the 5 observables, and these are biological effects on people and animals that are near these objects. And Sergeant Peniston mentioned some of these on being able to feel the electric charge from the craft. There are other effects as well, some involving radiation. So these things are not always safe to get close to. So I'll talk about some of these. The high accelerations and hypersonic velocities without signatures. We looked at some of these cases where we had enough information that we could start estimating speeds and accelerations And then one of the 3 videos that the Navy released was from of these tic-tac shaped objects that were observed off the coast of Southern California in 2004 by those in the Nimitz carrier group. And Kevin Day, the radar operator, would describe them, first detected them, observed them for about 2 weeks on and off. They would show up in groups from 5 to 10, basically show up on his radar at about 80,000 feet. It's twice as high as our passenger jets fly. That's way up there. They would appear on his radar at 80,000 feet, and then they would typically drop to about 28,000 feet, and then fly south from Catalina Island, which is just off Laguna Beach in Southern California. They'd fly south at only about 100 knots, which is something like 120 miles an hour. That's hard to do at 28,000 feet. There's not much air up there. You have to go fast to be able to get enough lift. So these things were already clearly strange. But they were flying south at only 100 miles an hour or so, all the way down to Baja California and Mexico till they reached around Guadalupe Island when they went off his radar. And he noted that periodically they would drop from 28,000 feet to sea level, possibly into the ocean, he didn't know, but they would make that maneuver and they would be able to cover that distance in 0.78 seconds, less than a second to go from 28,000 feet to the sea surface. 28,000 feet, that's like 5 miles. That's really crazy. So we thought, well, let's try to estimate these accelerations here. What's the minimum acceleration that you would need to make that maneuver? So the minimum acceleration would be to accelerate halfway at a constant rate and then to decelerate at the second half at the same rate, and that will bring you to a stop at the sea surface. So that gives you the minimum acceleration. And when you do this calculation, taking into account possible uncertainties as to what the heights were and that time, you get an acceleration of around 5,400 Gs. That's 5,000 times the acceleration of gravity. That is crazy. Pilots can't handle more than 10 Gs for fractions of a second, and 5,000 Gs would kill you, certainly. You would be a puddle of goo. And you can imagine, you can think it through. If you were, so if I'm kind to myself, the top half of my body weighs about 100 pounds. And now if you accelerate that, you increase the gravity to 5,000 Gs, that 100 pounds would turn into 5,000 times 100. So it's basically the top half of my body would weigh 500,000 pounds. So what would that do to the lower half of my body? It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this is not going to work. So this is an impossible acceleration, very hard to imagine. Our equipment can't even handle that. So you might say, well, certainly there aren't organisms on board, but maybe they're autonomous. Our equipment can't handle this. The new F-35 fighter, the wings rip off at 13 Gs. Missiles can handle higher accelerations. The frame of a missile can handle about 60 Gs before the frame starts to crumple up. So we can't even build equipment that can get past 100 Gs. This thing's accelerating at 5,000. Now we wanted also to estimate the power. How much power did it take to do this? And so those of you who are starting here at Yale, if you happen to take a physics class or you're taking one this semester as a freshman perhaps, you'll encounter this sort of equation. You can calculate the power as the force times the velocity. The force is the mass times the acceleration times the velocity. And so we can estimate the velocity is the acceleration times time. So we can put this all together and we can estimate the acceleration this way. The only problem is we can estimate the power. We know the acceleration. The problem is we don't know the mass. We don't know how much this thing weighs. And so what we did for our estimate was these objects are about the same size of an F-18, and we wanted to have a more conservative estimate. So we assumed that its mass was 1/10 that of the F-18, which is go an order of magnitude less mass than an F-18. So we're being a little kind in the mass estimate. So this comes out to be around 1,000 kilograms. And if you do this, the power as you're accelerating basically follows this curve. And the peak amount of power is 1,100 gigawatts. I don't know how many of you might remember the movie Back to the Future. With Doc Brown, he has his thing for the time machine, and it's 2.3 gigawatts, and he's all excited about 2 gigawatts. No, this thing has 1,100 gigawatts. That's a terawatt of power. That's insane. That's more than 10 times the total nuclear power output of the United States. In a 40-foot long craft? Is that possible even? That's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine you could play with energy at that scale. All of the things we make have some inefficiencies to them. And even if you have a 10% inefficiency, you're doing pretty well. Now imagine here you had a 1% inefficiency in their system. If you had even a 1% inefficiency, that means that you still have 10 gigawatts of power is being wasted and going into waste heat, basically heating something up. 10 gigawatts power would melt the craft in seconds. So it's hard to imagine that. So it's puzzling. We don't know, are we doing things, figuring out things wrong? Are they doing something so different that we're not getting it right? And maybe they're using much less power than we think they are. That's possible. Or is it that they are really good at what they do, that they don't have those inefficiencies? We don't know what the situation is. But these things are really strange. Now this has been known for a long time, and I was really surprised to find this out. Hermann Oberth, who's the German father of modern rocketry, he was the mentor to Wernher von Braun. So here's a picture of, I'll use the little mouse cursor here. This is Hermann Oberth in the center. This is Wernher von Braun. Hermann is the mentor of this guy. And Hermann Oberth gave a lecture on flying saucers back in 1954, 70 years ago. And these are the notes, these are his lecture notes. This is very understated, actually. Their speed is sometimes very high. 19 kilometers a second. So you can go to Google and convert that, or I've done it for you. That's 42,000 miles an hour. He says 19 kilometers a second has been measured with wireless measuring instruments, radar. Accelerations are so high that no man could stand it. He would be pressed to the wall and bruised. It's actually worse than that. The accuracy of such measurements has been doubted. If there were only 3 or 4 measurements, I would not rely upon them and I would wait for further measurements. But he says there is existing more than 50 such radar measurements. And he says the radar of the American Air Force and Navy, which are used in all its fighters, cannot be so inaccurate that the information obtained with them can be doubted completely. So somebody knew back in 1954 that these things could fly at up to 42,000 miles an hour. The probe, the New Horizons probe that we sent to the outer solar system that flew past Pluto in 2015 is currently flying at 40,000 miles an hour. These things move at spacecraft speeds, clearly. And this has been known since 1954. And if you want to know why he's so grumpy, it's because he knew this in 1954, and no one's listening to him. Still no one's listening. Right? You put this on the news, and they start giggling about little green men and mention seagulls, and that's nonsensical and ridiculous. We know that these things are extraordinary. And that's been known for a long time. There's other cases where other measurements have been done. radar observations at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. There were 2 glowing UFOs observed there. Minot Air Force Base supports nuclear weapons. We have intercontinental ballistic missiles there. And this is a common theme, it turns out. At 3 a.m. and approaching B-52H was alerted to watch for a bright glowing orange UFOs. During a turnaround, the radar systems of the B-52 detected the object about 3 miles distant from the airplane, following its descent rate, so it starts following the airplane. These things shadow airplanes. That is also common and disconcerting. David Mason, who we worked with at UAPX, has a FLIR video taken from his backyard of a jet airplane coming in for a landing at the Seattle airport, and it's being shadowed by a UFO. It's a 3-leaf clover-shaped object just following this jet airplane as it's coming in. This happens all the time. And shouldn't our pilots know what these things are? Shouldn't we be investigating this and educating people? I would think so. Because when pilots see these and they fly at the windscreens of passenger jets, the pilots panic. Of course they panic. And they have to control themselves to not take evasive maneuvers. You don't want to take an evasive maneuver in a 747 where you got 250 people eating pretzels in the back. That's dangerous. You're putting everybody's lives at risk. Why isn't the FAA all over this? They should be. Pilots should be reporting these every time it happens. It's ridiculous. So this object here, in this case, was 3 miles distant, and within 1 3-second sweep of the radar, the UFO closed 2 miles distance and was only 1 mile away. So pacing it for 20 miles. The plane banked and actually flew over the UFO, and they said it was egg-shaped and was glowing like molten lava. Claude Power, a French researcher, used that radar data and estimated the acceleration to be 209 Gs with a top speed of around Mach 12 or 9,000 miles an hour. Again, we have a lot of information that these things are really unusual. Anchorage, Alaska, in 1986, a Japanese airline, Boeing 747, was flying Beaujolais Nouveau back from Tokyo to Paris. When a skeptic hears that, they're like, oh yeah, of course they were flying Beaujolais Nouveau. They were drinking in the front and they're seeing UFOs. And no. The pilot, described as being 3 747s in length, was walnut-shaped. 3 747s in length is about the size of an aircraft carrier. So you basically have a flying aircraft carrier. When this thing was in front of their plane, he couldn't see anything out of the front window other than the craft. That's scary, and you can't be wrong about that. This thing followed them for 45 minutes across Alaska. Basically usually keeping a good distance away. I think it was 7 miles, and then would make jumps from 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock and back all over the place. Now these jumps were picked up on radar, and Dr. Daniel Kumbe, who was at the Niels Bohr Institute, analyzed this radar data set, and he estimated accelerations of up to 10,000 Gs, twice as much acceleration as I estimated in the Nimitz case. That's insane. The top speed of the object would have had to be Mach 350. That is like 270,000 miles an hour. Do you know how far you can go how far you can go traveling that fast? You can get to the moon in 53 minutes. This craft could take you to the moon. We'd be there by, what time is it now? It's probably like 10 o'clock-ish. We'd be there by 11, we could have lunch, and we'd be back here by 1. Seriously. And we're playing around with giant chemical rockets and launching them into space and taking 3 days to get there. Something's wrong. This is kind of silly at this point. And this is, again, from the radar data, and it matches the pilot's description of what he saw happening. So we know a lot about these objects. They exhibit extreme accelerations up to thousands of Gs. They've been tracked at hypersonic speeds in air, moving at spacecraft speeds in the air. When the space shuttle comes in from orbit, it's only going about 17,000 miles an hour. I mean, that thing's a fireball. These things, they don't, no fireball, no sonic boom, nothing. How does that work? We have no idea. There are some guesses, but they are really only guesses. Another confusing thing is when, in this case, when the object drops from 28,000 feet to sea level and then stops, that energy has to go somewhere. I'm a physicist. Energy doesn't disappear. It's conserved. That energy has to go somewhere, and typically goes into waste heat. So all of that energy, you should have deposited about 10 to the 11 joules of energy. Had to go somewhere when it stopped. That's about 100 tons of TNT. There should have been a big explosion when this thing stopped. That amount of energy, 100 tons of TNT, or 10 to the 11 joules of energy, is about the same as 250 Tomahawk cruise missiles going off at once. That's what should have happened when the thing stopped. Not observed. Nobody sees anything like that. These things are really strange. And again, why does everybody think they're spacecraft? Because they fly as fast as spacecraft fly. This is really simple. Could they be interstellar? Very easily. Could be. In fact, I'll show you some of the plots from this. You accelerate at only 1,000 Gs. So 1/10 of the acceleration from the JAL case. You can get to 90% the speed of light in 17 hours. And once you're going at that speed, relativity kicks in. Time slows down, all sorts of weird stuff happens, so you can travel long distances. So the spacecraft, time on the spacecraft will go slower at that time, at that speed. And so at 2,000 Gs, which would be twice this, you can get to Proxima Centauri, the nearest star. You can get there in 3 days. At 10,000 Gs, which was measured in the JAL case, that thing not only could it have gotten to the moon in 53 minutes, it would have gotten to the nearest star in about 0.7 days. 3/4 of a day. It could get to the nearest star. Could these be interstellar craft? Oh, heck yeah. Easily. Tau Ceti, which is, 12 light years away, it could have gotten there in less than a day. All the nearest stars, up to 50 light years from here, are a day trip from Earth for that craft. Now for us, because of relativity, for us, it'll take them 40 years to get there and 40 years to come back. But their crafts are going slower because they're traveling close to the speed of light. They could literally do it on their time in less than a day. These can easily be interstellar craft. And at this rate, actually, if you keep going, you can get across the galaxy in 3 months. Ship time. For us, it'll take 80,000 years. For them, 3 months. Now, it takes us 3 months to get something to Mars. This is significant. This is really significant. And when the director of Aero at the Pentagon was asked, do we have any evidence that these are non-human craft or possibly extraterrestrial? And he says, no, that's nonsense. They published this well before he was aware of this paper. He's aware of this work. He's aware of the radar data. Yes, easily interstellar, easily alien craft, easily. It's a no-brainer. Now, not only could they be interstellar craft, they would be excellent interstellar craft. Whoever made these are good at it, are excellent at it. Again, Welcome to Earth, bang, bang, bang. This is the typical story of our history. Here's a pilot going to talk about being given orders to shoot down a UFO. Was outed by the British. The British made their records public. And the American version of the records are still classified. But the British records are made public, so we know that his account is correct.
My first assignment out of F-86D school was RAF Station Manston. Don't forget it, it's the oldest base in England, in the RAF. I carry it right here. Bottom line, we finally became combat ready. We went down to Tripoli, Wheelers Air Force Base, fired rocketry, so we got pretty damn good at shooting down whatever it is that's going to come and get us. So they sent us back to England, and we became combat ready, which meant we were going to share with the RAF the defense of Britain during the Cold War years. But the bottom line was we're sitting alert, and sure enough, the klaxon goes off, and we scrambled. And we had a kind of a deal amongst the fighter pilots. The first one to the runway is the lead. I elected to be the first, and I got there. Anyway, when I got there and took off, they scrambled me. They said, heading at 020, and they gave us the frequency of GCI and said, contact GCI when you're airborne. I did. And when I did, and mind you, I was only 25 years old. I was, a kid, so to speak. But when I talked to the GCI, we're going to warn you, we're going to have a hot mission. You will have to fire all your rockets. Select 24. That's all the rockets we had, 24. And that ever scared the hell out of me. It was for real. I was an afterburner, and I said, I'd like to come out of afterburner. It said, no, go gate, stay gate. That was the symbol for going in your afterburner, because we want you to get this guy. He's been orbiting Ipswich, and he was in that area, and we're going to get you there. It took us out over France, and it turned us back. The firing heading was something around 350, something like that. But that's not important. What's important is we were in the soup, and I mean, it was solid. It was to 32,000 feet, and we never saw each other. I had my wingman with me until we broke off, and he went in trail with me. On the way up, they were positioning us to make this intercept on this orbiting vehicle. Apparently, somebody made a decision to shoot him down before I even was launched. I didn't know that, but they finally gave us our final vector, and we went in there, and they said, be advised, you'll have a bogey at 30 degrees at 15 miles on the port side. And sure enough, when I started painting it, I got this blob. It was not a blip, it was a blob. It was about the size you'd get of an aircraft carrier in the North Sea when you painted them. This was humongous for me. It was so strong that it literally, I didn't have to do anything to lock on except get the range gate marker near where the blip was. And boy, when it did, it just automatically, the lights went out, everything, and you had firing information already. It was one of those things that just was a storybook flight. So I was going in, and at 20 seconds to go, on the lock-on, we start our final penetration to the fire. Now, the information we get from the radar says this guy was going fast at this time. And he was going about maybe 100 knots faster than I was, and I was at Mach 0.92, which was all the F-86D could do. It's not like the modern jets. Well, sure enough, I started getting down there, ready to fire, and the circle started coming down, and the next thing I know, the overtake went from whatever it was, my speed, it was about 1,000 knots, something like that. If he took off at, I estimated about Mach 10 in an airplane that doesn't go Mach 10. Airplanes don't go Mach 10. Not that anything I've ever seen. And this was never made by a human being. This was something that was totally different. I've never seen. He could do things that I couldn't do. He could stop and start and keep going and everything else. But he took off. And he took off, and in 2 sweeps on the ground, he was off their scope. He was off my scope sooner than that. But as soon as that happened, the mission was over, and I couldn't fire. So on the way down, the GCI controller says, contact us on the landline. We have very important information for you. I said, Roger. And I did that. I recovered at Manston. The weather was still bad. It was still night. And I had an entire mission with night weather, which is Joule time on your Form 5. Anyway, I got down, got to the phone, called the landline, and they said, this is a top secret mission. I don't know why, but that's what it was. And it says, you're not to talk about it. We're going to send someone down from London to talk to you and debrief you tomorrow. I said, yes, sir, thank you, and hung up. Sure enough, the next day, a spook. You know what a spook is? A spook is some guy from Cloak and Dagger who wants to debrief you on something. So I don't know what the hell it was. You know, I'm not going to tell him. So anyway, he says, I want you to know this is a top secret mission. You're not allowed to tell your commander or anyone else anything about this, or we will take your wings away. You know, when you're 25 years old and you want to start flying, you don't want to hear that. So I put a zipper on my mouth, and that was the end of that. I could never talk about it again until Nick Pope's people from the Ministry of Defense, they call it MOD, M-O-D, like our DOD, exposed all their data on October 21st. I remember because I got a warning from a friend of mine in England that I would be exposed on my mission on October 21st. Sure enough, the phone started ringing. It rang for 4 days, non-stop. This is the London Times, this is so-and-so, ABC, NBC, name it, this is CNN, and so on. Anyway, make a long story short, I am now able to talk about my experience that I just told you about. Disclosure is what we need. There are many more people like me that are running around with secrets that they can't talk about because nobody will release it. And I think we should get together even with the Russians, because I'm sure they know a hell of a lot more about these aliens than we do. But it's a really important thing for us to know about this thing so we can go forward. They have technology that we haven't even dreamt of. I'm sure their propulsion system was something like anti-gravity or something like that, because they could stop on a dime, they can take off at Mach 10 or greater. It's unbelievable what they can do. So we need to know these things. So the only reason I'm here is to tell you, let's disclose this whenever we can, please. Thank you.
So these things have other interesting characteristics. Some of them are really bright, really crazy bright. What we find when we look at these photographs is these things are so luminous you can't actually see them well, and that becomes important in a bit. So this picture here was taken in Alberta by the Royal Canadian Air Force back in 1956. Dr. Bruce Maccabee studied the photograph, and the results were summarized and reported by Dr. Jacques Vallée. Basically, you can calculate the radiance of the object. I'm not going to go into the equations here. Equations and math happens. And so you can actually look at the film under a microscope and look at the how much it's been exposed. And if you do this and do the calculations, you find that given the estimated distance between 6 and 20 kilometers away from that object, the luminous power output was estimated between 2,000 and 30,000 megawatts of power in light. That's megawatts of light. You know what a 100-watt light bulb looks like. This is 300 times, well, actually 300 million times more, not brighter than a 100-watt light bulb. Now, this calculation is done assuming that it's radiating isotropically, same everywhere. Now, it's not quite clear where this object is with respect to the clouds, but if you were to have that much luminosity, you'd expect the clouds to be more illuminated. So perhaps this calculation isn't quite right, and the light was directed at the aircraft. And if you redo the calculation, you get a much lower number if it's directed at the aircraft. It turns out to be around 1.7 kilowatts, almost 2,000 watts of light. That's still a crazy bright light. What does anything need? Why do you need a 2,000 kilowatt light on something? Why would you need this? And I asked that question at the Soul Foundation meeting when I gave my talk there. And a good friend of mine who lives down the street from me, his name's Dave, we were driving to go see Dune 2, and he told me that he saw my talk, my Soul presentation, and was talking about the luminosity. He said, you know, there's one reason that I can think of that would, you would need that much light. And that's so that nobody can get a clear photograph of you. And I thought, that's probably the only, I thought that actually makes sense. And so since then I've wondered if they want to be observed, or they want to be seen, but they don't want to be observed. They want you to know they're there. They got lights on their craft. But they don't want you taking photographs and figuring out what they are and learning details. That seems, I think that might be an interesting hypothesis. So while there's other luminous power estimates that range from tens of kilowatts to hundreds of megawatts, these powers are on the order of, the power amount of light coming out is on the order of the amount of power from a nuclear power plant. These things are really pretty fantastic. They also have very strong electric and magnetic fields. These have been measured to some degree. And one interesting way to measure them is to use cars as detectors. So here's a scene from a movie you may have seen. It's from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This came out in 1977. It came out same year as Star Wars came out. Star Wars came out on, May 26, 1977, and this came out in December. This was the Christmas movie, right? I was 12, so I saw all of them many times. And I didn't like Close Encounters as much because it wasn't like Star Wars. There weren't laser guns and aliens and stuff fighting each other. But it turns out, now that I watch Close Encounters, it's a fantastic movie. Spielberg really nailed the phenomenon well. He captured a lot of aspects of what actually goes on. So I'll play this scene here and...
Help! I'm lost.
Go ahead. Responding to that 1060.
Come on, you're gonna cough up a little Toronto, right?
I am observing. Not sure
Toronto
exactly
or
what,
interstate.
but that's a negative on the
Highway
trip.
90, a little
Think it's
familiar
street lighting
landmark
in
of
the
some
Foothill
sort.
Residential. Cornbread Road south of 20. Sodium vapor street lights. Power must have been restored up there. A couple hundred neighbors in their PJs think it's Saturday night out here. Dispatch, this is 411. Do you want me to disregard that Delano call?
You're in the middle of the road, jackass!
Can you tell me where Cornbread is? Turkey! A34, F27. It's M Mary 10 through M Mary 12. Okay.
1047.
It's all meaningless so far. Okay, come on. All right, let's see. One-way stop leads you to the single circuits and leads you right to nowhere. Mary 10.
There's a couple things that are wrong. First, he is driving a Ford F-150 truck. It's a diesel engine. Diesel engines are not shut down typically by UFOs. That's very rare. So usually gasoline engines are shut down, not diesel engines. So there's a clue as to what's going on. The other thing is when a car is shut down, when a gasoline engine is shut down by a UFO and the UFO leaves, it turns out that 10% of the time the car will restart itself. Now, it doesn't start itself by turning over like it was doing here. Here you heard the electric, the starter motor running, turning the car over. That's not what happens. What happens instead is a piston fires and starts the engine. So these are reported effects. This happens in older gasoline engines. I don't know if it's known what happens in newer cars. Newer cars are shut down. I know this because I got an email from Chris Mellon, who was the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Bush and Clinton. I got an email from him 2 weeks ago telling me about a case near Pittsburgh, near where he lives in Pennsylvania, where a 50-foot cylinder flew over the highway and shut 2 cars down, and was asking me about this. So these are all effects that happen. This is the often blinding and burning. There's the number 6 of the 5 observables. And that little bit is what Spielberg got wrong. Now, it turns out that McCampbell had back in 1983 had a hypothesis as to what was going on. And first I'll really quickly describe what happened, how a car gasoline engine works. You've got a spark plug. The spark gap is sitting here in the piston, where you'll have a fuel air mixture if it's ready to go. And the distributor cam will close this switch. You'll get current flowing through the primary of the ignition coil, which is basically a transformer. When this opens again, the current stops. The magnetic field you get from the coil collapses. It induces a current here in the secondary, which has more windings, so it's a higher voltage. And it sends this to the distributor caps in the high voltage pulse to the spark plug, which jumps across the spark gap, ignites a fuel air mixture if the piston's ready to go, and the piston will fire. That's basically how this works. Now what happens when a UFO flies over, if you're close to a UFO, is the hypothesis is that these have very, very high electric fields on the order of 3 times 10 to the 6 volts per meter, which is high enough to ionize the air. The air is ionized. And you see this in some photographs. You see what looks like plasma around the UFO. You're ionizing the air, so the air becomes a plasma. So if you've got that going on, then the air is ionized, and that means that the spark plug is shorting out, because you can get current flowing through the air, so the spark plugs won't fire. Spark plugs don't fire, engine dies, and the car stops working. Now, while the UFO's there, the spark plugs aren't working. Even the distributor cam's also shorted out, so you have current flowing through the ignition coil, so the ignition coil has a magnetic field ready to go. Now the UFO leaves, the electric field is gone, the air is no longer ionized, and now this is open again, so now the current stops flowing, but because there was current flowing, the magnetic field collapses, induces current into the secondary, which sends a pulse to the spark plug, and the power stroke of your piston takes about 145 degrees out of a 720 degree cycle. So 10% of the time, that piston has fuel in it, ready to fire, and when that spark hits the spark plug, boom, it fires, the piston goes, starts the engine. So it should happen 10% of the time, and that's what you see. Mark Roediger has a catalog from 1981, where there's 268 cases in which the engine stopped, and 27 of them restarted as the UFO departed. That's 10%. We actually think we figured something out. I think McCampbell figured out what's going on in these cases. That's exciting. We can understand these things. It's even more exciting, perhaps, maybe not, I'm a physicist, it's not more exciting, but maybe more important, is that for this 27 out of 268 cases to be 10% and agree with the theory means not only that the theory is right, but it means that those 268 people were all telling the truth and reporting accurately. The witnesses were providing an accurate description of what happened, which is the first thing anybody questions when somebody tells a UFO story. The first thing anybody says is, "Oh, you can't believe witnesses because they misremember things and mix it all up, and you can't trust what somebody tells you." I'm sorry, you trust what people tell you all day long in everything you do. But when somebody tells you a UFO story, all of a sudden you can't trust people at all. Really? Are you serious? This is ridiculous. I call BS on the skeptics. I'm skeptical about their skepticism. It's denialism. And now we have data that shows that no, those 268 people were all telling the truth and reporting accurately. So electric fields on the order of 10 to the 6 volts per meter, generated by even a small UFO of radius of 5 meters, will require several coulombs of charge, amounting to something like 10 to the 9th joules of energy. It's about, about 100 times less the amount of energy that the Tic Tac would have had to deposit when it stopped. So that's the amount of energy of one Tomahawk cruise missile. That's crazy. That's a crazy high electric field. Magnetic fields, there's evidence that these objects also create very high magnetic fields. In some cases, it appears that they might be creating an effect called the Faraday effect, where the magnetic field from the UFO can change the polarization of light from the sky, and you can observe this in some cases. So if this is also going on, then you have incredibly high electric fields from 10 to the 11th to 10 to the 13th amp meters squared. They're just strong electromagnetic fields. That's all you need to know. So these things are very strange. Transmedium travel and affinity for water. This is a video from Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, of an object that is cruising along the ocean. It goes into the water and will come out. When it goes into the water, it doesn't make a splash. It barely interacts with the water at all. Really strange. And of course, the skeptics say this is a Chinese lantern, which is a balloon with a candle in it. Yeah, does that look like have you ever seen a Chinese lantern do this? You can't take half of the data and claim it's one thing and ignore the other half. It's not how thinking works. The underwater objects can be very strange indeed. This is an event that I learned about from the sonar operator of this. Seaman David Barnett was the sonar operator in this case. Starting in November in New Zealand, they were involved in daily exercises which seemed to be designed to draw USOs in, underwater objects in from the Pacific Ocean. So they would go up from Auckland up through the Haruki Gulf out into the Pacific Ocean, about 100 miles or so, turn around and then just come back. And then they'd watch with sonar to see if anybody followed them. And in many cases they were followed. In almost all the cases they were followed by objects that did not have propellers. There was no propeller wash, so they couldn't determine what the objects were. In one of those cases, they were followed by a very large object, which they measured to be 150 feet wide. And at one point, they made a sharp turn so they could try to measure it from the side, and they estimated its length to be 800 feet long. So this is a big object. The biggest submarines are the Russian Typhoon-class submarines, which are about 600 feet long. So this thing's longer than the biggest submarines. This object followed them at a distance of 2.5 kilometers. They were going at their maximum speed, making sharp turns at 28 knots, trying to shake this object and couldn't. And at one point, when they tried to shake it, this object closed the 2.5 kilometer distance in about 3 seconds. It closed that distance. The sonar operator said it was scary because they heard ping, 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 and then all the lights went out. All the power was drained from the ship, and their power was drained from their batteries. They couldn't restart the ship. They couldn't radio for help, and they were adrift for hours before they were rescued. And then, this is top secret, you can't talk to anybody about it, right? This is that's the standard mantra at this point. So you can estimate the minimum speed. This thing had to at least be going 100 or 1,800 miles an hour underwater. The thing's 150 feet wide. You've got to shove a 150-foot column of water out of the way in 3 seconds, and it's a 150-foot in diameter column of water that's 2.5 kilometers long, and you've got to shove that out of the way in 3 seconds. That's crazy. That's a crazy amount of energy. And you're doing this at a speed of 1,800 miles an hour minimum, at least this fast. The minimum acceleration is at least accelerated at 57 Gs underwater, and the top speed would have to be around almost 4,000 miles an hour. The other strange thing is that because of these speeds and accelerations underwater, it acts as if it doesn't interact with the water. Kind of like how in the air they don't make sonic booms, like they're not interacting with the air. That would be your first guess, But then the problem is that the sonar works. The sonar works by sending out pressure waves. Pressure waves are when atoms hit the object and bounce off, and that wave bounces off and you measure it. So the water is clearly interacting with the object when they're measuring with sonar, but when the object's moving and they're still measuring it, but it doesn't appear to be interacting with water. We have no idea what's going on. Transmedium travel of UFOs and these objects have been recorded for over 140 years. My favorite question that people ask is, "Oh, could they be Russian or Chinese?" Yeah, not in 1887. It wasn't. have you researched the topic at all? I mean, this is what's really amazing. No, these things have been seen for hundreds of years. The one in Newfoundland in November of 1887 was published in Astronomy magazine. The object emerged from the water. This disc emerges from the water, hovers next to the ship, and then shoots into the clouds. 1887. This has been going on a long time. And people have not been listening for a long time. It's a little surprising. There are Roman accounts of flying shields. In fact, there is a historical Roman account of a battle that was happening in this valley. And the Romans are fighting some barbarians or something, although they would call them barbarians. And during the battle, 3 flying shields came and flew low over the battlefield. Scared the pants off of everybody. The battle ended. That ended the battle, and everybody just took off running. That's a Roman historical account from 2,000 years ago. This has been going on throughout human history. So these UFOs appear to have an affinity for water. The number of sightings, the number of Russian sightings that were released maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, 2/3 of them were naval sightings. And of course, our Navy is the one involved as well. So these things are somehow related to water. It's not clear if maybe they have bases in our oceans. We don't know what the situation is. Somebody asked me recently, how big could any of these bases be? And I said, our oceans are not well explored at all. You could have New York City at the bottom of the Pacific, out in the middle of nowhere, and no, we would never know. We don't know. Mars is better mapped than Earth at this point, because 70% of the Earth's surface is water. The planet's horribly named. I mean, next to Uranus, it's probably the worst named planet in the solar system. The planet should be called water, or aqua, or ocean, or something like that. It's not, what you see outside when you go out today is not what Earth typically looks like. So, we don't know if they have bases, if somebody has bases there, or cities, or we don't know if, it appears that we may actually share this planet with somebody else. And we don't know who that somebody is. And we shoot at them regularly, and the situation's kind of nuts. And we don't know where they're from. We don't know if they lived here the whole time. Are they from Earth? Did they evolve on Earth like we did? Or are they from somewhere else and came to Earth and live in our oceans? Don't know. I would also recommend that we pay close attention to the other ocean worlds in our solar system. These moons, this is Europa, and Ganymede and Callisto, 3 moons of Jupiter. This is Enceladus, the moon of Saturn. They all have oceans under the ice. They have an icy surface with an ocean underneath. And so we should be paying attention to those worlds too. Maybe they come from there, maybe they also live there. Well, thank you for your kind attention. If you somehow want to see more of me after this long talk, you can see me at Share the Sky and Netflix Encounters. I'm in episode 3. This was nominated for an Emmy. It's great. It did not get the Emmy last night. The Emmy went to the documentary on science fair kids. which I'm happy with. Let the kids have the excitement. I don't need that. So, thank you so much.